Thanks for coming today. My name is Freya Bernson. I'm with the Indiana Native Plant Society as a stewardship chair. So we're just going to talk about invasives today. Why I'm up here talking, this is just my little background. I have been with INPS since 2019. I do have about 7+ years of professional ecological restoration experience throughout the tri-state area. I am a native plant nerd, for sure. I have like a lot of plants planted in my yard. All right, so the Indiana Native Plant Society, for those who aren't familiar with it necessarily, this is just our mission statement. Allen County is represented by the Northeast chapter. And then, okay, so my goals for today, we're going to talk about what actually does it mean to be an invasive. Why is it important to know about them? We're going to talk about some of the ways and tools you can identify them more, and there are numerous ways to address them in your daily life. We'll hopefully cover all that. All right. So the federal definition of an invasive species or an invasive plant, it's a non-native to the ecosystem under consideration species whose introduction may causes or may cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So, and I put some links on here. I'm going to try and get this sent out to folks who are interested in having this presentation, so you can just have the links as well. But invasive species info.gov is where this definition comes from. All right, so non-native does not necessarily mean invasive. So you can have non-native plants in your yard and they're not going to cause harm necessarily. And so my favorite example is hostas. I forgave hostas after I learned, I haven't tried them yet, but allegedly you can eat them. But they're also cool plants. A lot of people love hostas. And they don't seem to spread into natural areas. They don't cause harm. So that's my favorite example. So can a native plant be an invasive plant? No. ... If it's a native to the ecosystem that it evolved in, it's not an invasive. There are some plants that can spread rapidly. They're a lot more aggressive than other plants, and they can look like, from outward appearances, like they're behaving like an invasive, but they're behaving the way they're supposed to in that ecosystem. So what is the line? There is no line. It's gray. It's very gray area. So locust, if you're familiar with those, they are not native to northeast Indiana, but they are native to extreme southern Indiana. People have just spread them around because they like them as either timber or possibly, I'm sure somebody thinks they're a nice landscaping plant, but they sucker and they do all sorts of things. They're very good at spreading themselves around. So I have, in my professional life, done some management of black locusts in Michigan and northern Indiana because they can outcompete other native species that we want growing in the areas that the black locusts have been introduced to. All right, so another thing is, you'll hear people like to say, green is good though, right? And I would counter that with, good versus bad isn't necessarily the best way to look at it. Putting our values on it that way, it's more about, is it causing harm, or is it not causing harm? What does that mean? Sometimes it can get kind of complicated. Invasive species are just trying to kind of thrive in where they've been introduced to, but sometimes, again, that causes harm to the native species that we have there, and then we ultimately should, or potentially should consider doing something to address that. So the goal today is this is not about causing fear or any kind of negative feelings towards invasive species, but I just want to talk about kind of like what they do, why it's important to know about them, and then you take that as you will. So I follow that with what can they really do. So this is a brief list of all the things that invasive plants can do. So they outcompete native plants for resources. They overtake habitat of native plants. Those are kind of synonymous, but they impact the native animal species that depend on native plant species. A lot of animals are very dependent on specific plant species, and they don't like to eat the invasives, which we'll kind of talk about why that helps the invasive spreads later. So that can ultimately reduce biodiversity as things spread and become monocultures, with invasive monocultures. And then that can also adversely affect the local environment, ecology, and economy to a point. So this picture is a wall of glossy buckthorn in a woodland, probably a wet woodland. And if you've ever gotten a chance to, especially southern Michigan, there's just a ton of glossy buckthorn, and it will just fill spaces. And when it leaves out, it just completely overshadows the floor of the forest or fen or whatever it's growing in. All right, where did they come from? Mostly us. So people have brought most of these invasive, or actually all of them, to a point in some way or other. Some of them were intentional, some of them were not. And so why do they grow so well when they aren't from the place that they're in now? Which, because they're not from here, multicolor rose is not from Northeast Indiana. Why does it do so well? There's a lot of reasons. So there's one concept of competition or predator release. So when we bring these plants here, they are no longer around the insects and other animals or parasites that eat them. And so they're much more healthy here. And so they can spread, and they do. And then land use changes. So when we put in roads or do housing developments or agricultural practices, some of those things change the soil and nutrient loads. There's a lot that goes into that, and so that makes it much more easy for these invasive species to invade because, just a side note, many of our native species are adapted to very low soil nutrients. That's why it's fun when you plant native species. Once you get them going, this is a blanket statement, but many of them do very well in poor soil because that's what they've evolved to live in. But many invasive species can take advantage of high nutrient loads and then just go wild. And then typically, most of the invasive species that you talk about, they grow quickly and they multiply rapidly. So they're very good at making seeds or rhizomes and spread underground, and they just take off. So those are some of the characteristics and things that contribute to their spread and why it happens. You can see, red and green are colors that you can perceive in this picture. All of that pink is burning bush, and so that's taking over the understory of that woodland. If you want to see this in real life, come out to Lindenwood. We do typically an annual burning bush cutting in the fall, there's plenty left. We've been doing that for a couple of years now. INPS partners with the city and does invasive species removal there, but it's a really good example of how much it can spread in a woodland like that. And this is the kind of burning bush a lot of people have in their landscaping at home. And another thing, our native insects need native plants. Many insects that are native here require specific species of plants, especially Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies have a very small range of plants that they can eat. And typically, those invasive plants don't fulfill those needs. So the invasive species, they don't provide food for those native caterpillars, and they compete and take space from native plants that the caterpillars need. And so that doesn't just impact our insect species, but it impacts everything that eats those insect species. And so it works its way throughout the food chains and net webs and however you look at it. But it's basically, they're just not providing the food for our wildlife that we want to have around. One thing I recently learned was that invasive bush honeysuckle leaves actually, compositionally, they're able to decompose faster, and that puts nutrients back in the soil faster, and so those plants are able to actually kind of sort of fertilize themselves and then spread better, and it changes the soil dynamics beneath those plants, and it actually kind of favors the invasive plant as they go. And I just think that's wild. It's like they're changing, and that apparently they can cause other plants' leaves to decompose faster as well. It's just wild stuff. They can so that, calorie pear tree in your yard or in your neighborhood, birds are eating those berries or those fruits, and they're carrying the seeds in their crops, and they're digesting it and pooping it out far away from your house or your neighborhood. And then wind will carry a lot of seeds. Water, if you have a stream or you're near a stream, will carry a lot of seeds away. Boots, don't clean your boots after you walk in your yard. All of these things can carry these things away, even though you're not seeing it spread in your specific neighborhood or yard. Another one, the sterile cultivars thing. So the landscaping industry has come up with a lot of new plants, and a lot of them look really neat. I mean, I've seen all sorts of colors of echinacea. They're cool. But they also say, in the past, the Bradford/calorie pear was believed to be a sterile cultivar. And barberries, Rose of Sharon, all of these things, they have developed sterile cultivars that then, through different means of biological activity, have found a way to spread. So people are out there working on this very hard for many, many years. The Indiana Terrestrial Plant Rule is it's a relatively new law. I think it's of 2018. I think I have it in here somewhere. Just less than a decade old, and that makes it illegal to sell, gift, barter, exchange, distribute, any way, move invasive plants, basically. But it only lists 44 species. That's all they could get on the initial list when they got it through. So I did want to talk about some management methods for invasives, and because they're all different. So I mean, there are group plant types require different types of management. So these are just kind of in a nutshell. Some of them you can pull, and sometimes you have to bag them out. Like yesterday, a group of folks went out and we were pulling garlic mustard and bagging it because it was already blooming. If we had pulled it and threw it on the ground, it could have potentially continued to develop seeds and then spread, and then all that work would have been wasted. But the Dame's rock that we were pulling, we just were putting it in trees or on rocks where it could dry out because it wasn't blooming. It wasn't going to finish making its seeds. Mowing is an option pretty much just to keep things from flowering and going to seed. It's not a great method for killing things, but it's a tool that you can use. Herbicide is kind of a contentious topic sometimes, and if there's a way around it, I always encourage it, but some plants kind of require herbicide if you want to be successful in getting rid of them in an area. Fire, prescribed burns, is another tool. It frequently doesn't kill species or plant species, but it can be added to your repertoire of tools. And then education, essentially prevention. So you're already doing something just by being here. All right, so I have a couple, or about 5 or 6 really top invasive. Currently, there are a lot. Again, potentially over 450 that you could run into depending on the habitat, the place, or in time. So this one is lesser celandine. Perhaps you've seen it. It is also called Big Buttercup Pile Award. I've included the scientific name in all of these plants as well. It's always good to double check that, so because common names are kind of weird sometimes, and sometimes they're applied. You could call this plant whatever you wanted to as a common name, but if you want to make sure that you're talking about this specific plant, you want to say Ficaria verna. Ranunculus ficaria is its old name because of course we have to change the names to make it confusing. But that's the best way to know that you're talking about the same one. But if you say lesser celandine, most of the time people are going to know what you're talking about. So this one grows in dense masses. It will outcompete other understory plants, especially spring ephemerals, and it takes away those food sources for our native pollinators, and it's very persistent and it spreads very rapidly. Another one, Tree of Heaven. This one's lesser celandine's all over Fort Wayne. Tree of Heaven is also in a lot of places in Fort Wayne. And Ailanthus altissima, so it's a rapid spreader. It is also hard to kill, and it's also the preferred host of the spotted lanternfly. Who's heard of the spotted lanternfly? Okay, good. Yeah, so they're getting the message out there. So what happened was we introduced Tree of Heaven as an ornamental species, and it has spread rapidly. And then the spotted lanternfly was introduced accidentally, and it now has this habitat that it can spread through. So it really likes Tree of Heaven, but then it also is harmful to a lot of our crops and potentially wild spaces too. So that's problematic. That's one of the worst things about it. But Tree of Heaven is also incredibly difficult to kill. So this image, that tree in the circle, is a dead adult tree that was killed in a fire. So we did a prescribed burn on this site. But that didn't kill the tree. All those little things are suckers from the root. Oh. And that patch is about half the size of this room. So I was just incredibly impressed by this plant. Japanese stiltgrass, another one that's in this area, and potentially spreading. So it also smothers understory plants, similar to lesser celandine, only this one persists longer throughout the year. So it spreads through water. It'll go down waterways, watercourses. Roadside mowers are a big spreader because they don't necessarily clean their equipment between roadsides, and so they can actually pick up these seeds, these plants. If they are cut low, grazed or mowed, they can actually set seed in the stems of the plants at like 3 inches. So you go through and mow that, you're just picking up seeds and just pushing them down the roadway. And then, boots too. They're tiny little seeds. You can pull and bag this one. It's an annual, so it doesn't have very deep roots. In the circle, this is another identifying characteristic of this. They have that very light silvery mid vein on top of the plant, on top of the leaf. This one I included because I feel like I see it more and more planted in folks' landscaping. So Miscanthus sp is a species. There's multiple species of silvergrass, and they're all potentially invasive. They aren't as spread here as they are in the south. If you get a chance to drive around certain parts of North Carolina, this certain species of Miscanthus just line the roadways in woodlands. And so it's a fast spreader. Again, it pushes out natives. But the other thing this one does is it will literally change fire regimes. So it can make a place more flammable that wasn't necessarily as flammable as it was before this stuff was there. So when it dies and dries out, it can actually be a potential risk for extended or more wildfires. Calorie repair, I just could not talk about this one because we hear about it all the time. It outcompetes native vegetation. It's spread by birds and landscapers. and us sometimes, treatment, primarily you need to cut it and treat the stump. Smaller ones you could theoretically foliar spray, but it depends on the plant size and stuff, so majority of the time cutting and treating, whether it's a big one or even a small one. There are some experts in here that know how to deal with calorie repair, so I can direct you to them if you want to talk to them. And you want to treat the stump, because if you just cut the species, it will sucker back from that stump and grow back, and so basically your efforts were wasted, and it's frustrating. So the flowers stink, in my opinion. I said it. So they are the same: calorie pear, Bradford pear. There's a slew of common names, but it is ultimately Pyrus caloriana is the official name. They're all the same plant. So they sort of look like native plums, some viburnums and service berries. They all have white flowers, but the calorie pear has those delightful false thorns on that top picture. Those hurt when they get you. And then they have those kind of shiny, roundish leaves, and the fruits. There's nothing else that looks 100% like this out there. And again, they will inhabit the understory of woods and fill up grasslands. Prevention in this case. So I really like the concept of the invasion curve. This is just a diagram, like a theoretical diagram. It's not anything specific, but so you start at the bottom left with the introduction, like the first handful of species or of individuals of an invasive species. They're not invasive yet because they're just right there. But then they start to spread, and then eventually somebody realizes that, oh, that's spreading, and it's growing in places that it wasn't planted intentionally. And then by the time, but if you do something about it early on, you could theoretically eradicate it. As it progresses and people start to see it in more and more places, eradication becomes more and more difficult and costly. Especially, there's a lot of person power and equipment power, and just everything costs a lot to get rid of these things. And then as you continue and time goes on and it continues to go and we're unable to catch up with it, eventually the only thing you can do is essentially local control and management. So one thing you can see in certain nature preserves is you will see the property line, because it will be, let's say, reed canary grass on the neighbor's property because they don't want to treat it, or they haven't decided to treat it yet or whatever. And then next to that is the nature preserve side, and the reed canary grass is not there. The minute treatment stops, that reed canary grass will continue to spread back into that nature preserve, and so that's what they're talking about: local control and management only. And you have to keep that up, otherwise it will just come back. And so what we're hoping to do with some of these, especially as we identify things that are problematic, is to stop planting them and start getting rid of them. And there's ways to kind of tell if something could be problematic. So anyways, again, I'm not here to strike fear in your heart. I don't want that. It's just sharing information. So what can you do? First of all, don't buy invasive plants. If you don't know a plant, look it up. Check that MIPIN list of 450 species, because you can buy. There's a lot of things and that you can buy that might be on that list. And there are a lot of cool looking plants out there that are kind of invasive. Plant natives instead. And there's a lot of resources out there for that, and the Indiana Native Plant Society is more than happy to share that information with you. Have a plan for what you're going to do. If you have invasives or you in the future spot one at your home or school or office, And, you know, keeping your gear clean, cleaning your boots after every nature preserve you hike at, or anytime you get mud on your boots. It's good to just clean them off somewhere, especially at the place that, you know, before you get in your car and leave, that's best. And then, you know, volunteering at places like local nature preserves is really good because you can learn about the invasive species problems in those areas. And then you also get to, you know, physically help with the effort. Sharing what you learn about that stuff is great. I know a lot of people who do that. And then supporting public policies and programs that control invasives, such as the Indiana terrestrial plant rule, and answering surveys and supporting those things, so that they can get the public support to show that yes, people want this stuff to be banned, and then report stuff. Plant native plants, and so where to get them? The IndianaNativePlants.org site has a list of certified native plant sellers. It's not all of them in the state. I know a couple that sell native plants and they're totally trustworthy that aren't listed, but it's a really good place to start. And I just listed some native plant benefits. I'm going to kind of breeze through here because I want to give time for questions. But you know, native plants, they evolved to live here, and so they're really good at living here. So if you can't, they're drought resistant. You know, they filter water. They improve your soil quality. They do so much. I don't know. They're not magical, but they kind of are. And then more benefit. You know, they support pollinators. They're host plants for pollinators. You know, they support birds. They just support biodiversity. I really like this John Muir quote, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And so, yeah, that's really applies to native plants, and so we don't want to lose them in our area, because if we do, we're impacting everything else in the universe. And you know, you are supporting biodiversity by planting native plants. All of these pictures are from my front yard, and I just, you know, I try to get them, get as many bug pictures as I can because I love bugs. And that one on the right is native praying mantis. This is Carolina mantis. You didn't know we have non-natives, but you know, that's a conversation for a later time. And then, yeah, that's it.